Greetings, how you doing? This is Kinesiology 214, and this presentation will be an extension of program design and understanding the client who's in front of you, or the athlete, or your patient. But specifically, this is going to delve more into the sport training continuum seen on the right-hand side of the bell curve we saw in the previous presentation. So in that presentation, we talked about how you have this concept of you can have a distribution across a population of people. And in general, if you're in the fitness world and you're doing personal training, the majority of the people are going to fall within one standard deviation or another on either side of the mean. As you get more specialized and perhaps go into a prehab rehab clinic or more on the strength and conditioning side, the people who are in front of you, that population will change. And so I kind of talked a little bit about it in terms of that skewness that you see. And I brought up kurtosis and skewness. And it's really when you look at that distribution of people. Now, what happens is when you get into a college coaching environment, which is really what we're going to talk about in this presentation, the majority of people now are over to the right. Now, sure, you're going to have some really gifted athletes who are way over to the right, a couple standard deviations, but in general, you're going to look at taking this group of people over on the right-hand side and design and develop programming for them. And the people who are over there, unless of course they had some kind of knee issue or they had a hip thing or they blew their back out squatting, if they're working with the athletic training department, they're going to be further over to the left as opposed to the right. And you have to work on bringing them back into being a functioning athlete, because an injured athlete is no athlete at all. But for the sake of this conversation and this presentation, we're focusing on the folks who are over here on this side of the spectrum, more on the strength conditioning programming side of the spectrum. And when you look at taking that population, you can have it where you have this kind of negative skew or positive skew. So negative skewness is when you have that hump over to the right. And so when you look at this, let me get myself the heck out of the way here. Put me up here. You know, knowing this is important because if you do evaluate the people that you're coming across in a college environment, they're going to be stacked up over to the right, to be quite honest. Your distribution is going to have everybody you're working with as an athlete, and some of the people who are perhaps injured, like I mentioned before, are going to be over here, and you're working on bringing them back over. And the thing is, you're going to have different subpopulations in here. And what's important to also notice is this does not differentiate between someone who is a tennis player or a football player or a soccer player or a baseball player. They are all high-level athletes in this example. Different sports have different demands, as we'll see. But if you're coaching in a college environment and you're working with athletes, even in a high school environment, you're going to be dealing with different sports. Those people are in general on the right-hand side of the bell curve. So now anybody who comes into your weight room or comes in to be coached by you, you know everybody you work with is going to be over on the right-hand side. You know if you're in a prehab rehab clinic or an extended care facility working with people hands-on, doing different modalities to mobilize people, you know most of the people you deal with all day long are going to be from the left side of that bell curve. So understand how the population in front of you matters. And it matters because it's usually important in a program design in knowing who's in front of you and knowing how you're going to develop your programming to best get a training response. And it's so crucial to have a concept of that person, where they are today and where you want to take them down the road, and understanding if they're more on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of that bell curve. And if we look at this a little bit further, and this one I know you got to remember this from earlier on in the term. I knew we would get back to it. I did some foreshadowing early on. And we talked about this. We had anaerobic on one side, aerobic on the other, Olympic weightlifting on one side, distance runners on the other. One is predominantly an energy source, which is carbohydrates or glycogen. On the right-hand side, it's predominantly fat. And I talked about the couch spud versus the sprinter on TV, etc. And we talked about some just training programming in terms of how many reps you would normally do to elicit the proper training response if you were an Olympic weightlifter versus a distance runner, and really what the duration of activity is. I mean, Olympic weightlifting, it is fractions of a second. It's not even 10 seconds. But for sake of this graph and bringing it back in from session 3 or 4, I think it was, just to kind of give a refresher, it was 10 seconds, 45 seconds, 90 seconds, and 20 minutes. And if we take this a step further and we look at it from this perspective, you know, on one side of that continuum, you have folks who are very explosive, the other side more endurance oriented. And you know this from your other classes as well, I'm sure you do. You have the predominant energy system is adenosine triphosphate, ATP, and then the other is the aerobic system where you use Krebs cycle to create phosphocreatine and creatine to regenerate that whole cycle to actually have energy to be able to complete an activity. And it's really that anaerobic threshold that's so crucial in these activities that takes a person from ATP PC to where they are in Krebs cycle and they're able to actually create more ATP over and over and over and over to be able to do their activities. I digress. Here's what we're after though. When you look at this, on one side you have Olympic weightlifters and you have a 10,000 meter runners, but you can literally take different sports and put them on this continuum to have an understanding of the sport demands that are required. So you got weightlifting, okay, we got throwers and sprinters, 400-meter runners. Now we're getting more into the lactic acid here. You got 1,500 meters, 5,000, 10,000. I would tell you these guys are running right at anaerobic threshold at high levels, and they are bumping right along that threshold, and they've trained their bodies to be able to do that. But if we look at other sports, over here on the ATP PC side, very explosive side of the equation, you have jumpers, baseball, surprisingly, softball, and football. And football could actually be a little bit further over to the right here. I just couldn't really finagle it with the spreadsheet in PowerPoint. But you look at baseball and softball; those are very explosive sports, and they come off first as like very lazy man sports, but actually they're not. You look at tennis; tennis is explosive, but you have to be explosive over and over and over, and the duration of a tennis point can be anywhere from a fraction of a second if a person serves an ace, where it could be 20 different volleys where it ends up being 30, 40 seconds. Football, on the other hand, you're talking about like 5 to 7 seconds. 5 to 7 seconds, repeat. 5 to 7 seconds, rest, repeat. 5 to 7 seconds over and over and over again. So football is actually a little bit more to the left because there's a shorter duration in the activity, but the rest itself is a little different. In some regards, football has a little bit higher degree of predictability than tennis because of the way tennis is. You might have longer points as opposed to shorter points if it's an ace serve. 400 meters, you're right there in that lactic acid zone where you start getting into soccer and basketball and even lacrosse where it's continuous play back and forth. So let's take this a step further and look at baseball because really on this continuum you can further subdivide whether it's football, lacrosse, you might have a midi who's running up and down the field all the time as opposed to your goalie. I mean, that's a very good example of how they have different demands placed on different positions within a sport. Offensive linemen, defensive backs, and running backs in football are another example. Now, if we look at baseball, and we just kind of subcategorize the sport of baseball, even softball, if you want to use this for an example. You have infielders, outfielders, and pitchers, right? And when you look at this, your infielders have to be very explosive, be very quick-footed, have to have a very high degree of agility, and be able to, and this is important too in sport activities, and I think this is sometimes missed by novice coaches, there's an activity-based response that happens within sports. And that happens because as I'm standing there playing shortstop or third base, I used to play third base when I was a kid, I'm playing third base, I'm in the corner of my eye, I can see the pitcher is pitching the ball as he winds up and he moves. I'm anticipating that movement. Yes, of course I am. But what ends up happening is bat hits ball, I respond to that bat hitting ball and then to the ball, and then I make my play and throw the ball to first base, throw him out, or throw a double play. So the important part here is, the infielder is based upon a response stimulus, and the response stimulus demands a very, very high degree of turnaround. And that response time is very short because the distance between home plate to me at third base is very short, 90 feet. And when you look at also the other demands that are involved in being a baseball player, being an infielder, you have shorter throws. There's some degree of predictability here because that ball is going to be hit to you and you're going to first base, or that ball is hit to you and you're going to second, and then somebody else is throwing the ball at first. So there is a degree of predictability of what's going to happen if you're forced to make a play on the ball. This requires a very high degree of eye, hand, and foot coordination to make all this happen. Now, if we look at the outfielders, outfielders stand out in the outfield and you jokingly say like they're picking their dandelions. No, they're out there and they have to respond to bat on ball to every play to cover behind another person in the infield. If there's a missed ball, that outfielder has to be behind the third baseman to be able to be in position to field that ball. But here's the thing, an outfielder will have longer bursts when they respond to a stimuli. Bat hits ball, they have to sprint 20 yards back, turn hips, make a catch, and then be able to catch and then throw the ball into the infield. So the activity is based upon a stimulus and they're responding to it. The time to respond is actually longer because of the flight of the ball. There's actually fractions of a second greater amount of time to respond. And it requires the outfielder to run with short bursts and have a high degree of sprinting ability, whereas your infielders have a high degree of agility. Not to say that they wouldn't do sprint work and work on running mechanics to be more efficient when they run and do their conditioning, but just realize this is certainly ATP. This is also ATP all day long. It's very short and very explosive, but they're responding to that stimulus and they're responding to catch a ball, and they have to run a longer distance to make that happen. And also with the outfielders, their throws are longer to get the ball from center field over to third base once they catch the ball. So the demands even there are different between the infielder and the outfielder. Now a pitcher, on the other hand, very, very different example, right? They have to have power endurance. So they have to be highly explosive over and over and over and over again. And it's really quite predictable. You may not know this or not, but baseball uses a pitch count, and they have a predictable amount of pitches that they want pitchers to throw in a game. Many times you see a pitcher taken out early. Perhaps they're not doing bad. It's just they've reached their pitch count. Sometimes they can go deeper into a game, and they go deeper into a game because they've not reached their pitch count. So with that, there's a bit of predictability in terms of just how explosive they have to be over and over and over again for also how long. So if you think about like frequency, intensity, and time, well, you can kind of map out how many repetitions they would actually end up have over and over and over, maybe 85 pitches, 100 pitches in a game, and you know that going in. So with a pitcher, though, the distance is 60 feet 6 inches, so they have to be very aware of what's going on, and they have to be very responsive if a ball is hit towards them. There is very little time for them to respond. And the other part of this is, with the pitching and the throwing component, whereas infielders have shorter throws, outfielders have longer throws, this is predictable, 60 feet 6 inches, over and over and over again. The only time it will vary is if they have to throw the ball to second base, catch the ball, throw it to first base, whatever it is, that this is a predictable distance over and over and over again. So what I want you to really wrap yourself around is give consideration to the person that's in front of you. Where in the world are they on the bell curve? Know the current environment. Know if you're teaching or if you're coaching strength conditioning, if you're working in a prehab rehab clinic, and know the patients and clients and athletes that are going to be coming in to meet with you with regularity. Because knowing that gives you a better understanding of who's in front of you and gives you a better understanding to be able to program for those people. And that allows you to be able to have a better program design to understand where they are and where you want to take them down the road. And further, and one other summary point is, when you get into sport-specific training, you have to have an understanding of where they are in the sport. And really, it is having a keen understanding of the person, the sport, and as we saw in a real simple example with baseball, the particular demands of different positions within the sport that matter. And that matters because it allows you as a practitioner to be able to design and develop training programs where you're applying the proper stimulus for the sport, for the position, and for the person. And to be able to do that is a pretty powerful tool. So to that end, guys, I hope you're able to take this in and kind of process all that. It's a lot to really kind of wrap yourself around for one presentation, but as you'll see in the next subsequent several presentations, as you start to put the pieces together, it'll become more apparent to you. All right, guys, signing off.